On this Thursday night, desperation becomes deadly in Afghanistan. Terrorist bombs turn Kabul's airport into a bloodbath. Canada's evacuation mission is over. What happens to those we've left behind?
We're continuing to do everything we can.
U.S. soldiers are among the dead. How will the president respond? Residents of a fire-ravaged BC village eager to return and rebuild.
Everything I had was in there.
Plans to prevent another devastating disaster. And election reflections. And asking if you've decided how you're going to vote.
Ooh, big question.
I talked to voters about who deserves to win.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
It is as far west as you can go in Canada. We are in British Columbia tonight, a province that in many ways is the envy of the world. Vancouver consistently ranks as one of the best places to live, and it's a place that will play a key role in who forms the next government of Canada. Good evening and thanks for joining us. We are at Vancouver's Maritime Museum in Kitsilano, the first stop on a cross-country tour during the federal election campaign. But we begin tonight with events in Kabul, Afghanistan, where danger has turned to catastrophe. 2 bombings on the perimeter of the airport and at a hotel have killed dozens of Afghans and at least 13 U.S. soldiers. Many others are injured. Kabul hospitals are overwhelmed. The images from the scenes are deeply upsetting. We are not going to show you the worst of them, but a warning, what we are showing is disturbing. People died where they stood, so crowded into the area outside a gate to the airport, standing in a trench for sewage water, hoping they'd be on a flight out of that country, that it was a bloodbath. These images were shared by a former Afghan interpreter who was safe after the blast. It's not clear if among the dead are other Afghans who worked with Canadian forces and were approved to come here. An Afghan branch of the so-called Islamic State has said it was behind the attacks. They are more extreme than the Taliban, who they consider the enemy, along with America and the West. And now that the U.S. has handed the country to the Taliban, more attacks are inevitable. Many evacuation flights have stopped. As Mike Armstrong reports, the future for Afghans trapped under the Taliban is now even more uncertain.
They had gone to the airport to be saved. Afghans desperate to get on a plane out of the country, instead dying or injured, waiting. Canadian officials say they'd had multiple warnings in recent days a terrorist attack could be coming. This man says he was at the airport trying to get a visa to the U.S. when an explosion went off in the middle of the crowd. Now, there had been public warnings. The countries involved in the airbridge operation on Wednesday had told people to avoid the airport, that there could be a terrorist attack. Despite that, Thursday, the crowds were so big, tear gas and fire hoses were used to keep people back. The area was still packed when the bomb went off. This witness says people were thrown all over, some blown into pieces. The U.S.-led operation is now drawing down. Several countries are flying their last evacuation flights. Some, like Canada, are already done. The chief of the defense staff says only a handful of Canadian soldiers are left. They've stayed behind helping with logistics as the international effort wraps up. The CDS called the decision to leave heartbreaking.
The Taliban are the ones who are restricting the ability of so many to get to the airport to be extracted. So put the blame on them, please.
Canada's final numbers are now known. Since the beginning, about 3,700 Afghans were flown out, about 1,000 on the last day. What is not known is how many have been left behind.
It's just nonstop tragic news.
Dave Morrow is one of the Canadian veterans who's been working to get interpreters and Afghans who worked with Canada out of the country. In recent days, they'd been telling families to go to the airport to look for Canadian troops. Now they're trying to figure out whether families they were trying to save are among the victims.
That's Afghanistan in a nutshell. You know, like it's just mind-numbingly sad.
The blast was
Global News spoke to an Afghan man who's been trying to get to Canada. He was near one of the explosions Thursday. We're protecting his identity, but he says his years of work for Canada have now made him a target. In his words, it's ruined his life, and not just his.
I have got 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls, and now their life in jeopardy as well.
Canadian officials insist efforts to save more Afghans will continue. But getting people out was hard enough when there were resources in the country. Very soon, there will be nothing at all. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
There have been multiple terrorist bombings by ISIS-K in Afghanistan over the last few years. They just didn't get much attention in the West. This, because of the toll and because American soldiers were killed, has drawn in Western leaders, including the American president. Joe Biden spoke not long ago. Let's go to our Washington bureau chief, Jackson Proskow. Jackson, what was his message?
Well, Donna, President Biden acknowledged the difficult circumstances here and the heartbreak felt by the families of those American soldiers. He also made it clear it's time for the war in Afghanistan to come to a close, and so the evacuation mission is going to proceed and wrap up as planned by August 31st. Keep in mind that today's attack was the second deadliest single incident involving U.S. troops in the entire 20-year presence in Afghanistan. This was also exactly the kind of attack the U.S. had warned about in recent days. President Biden says the U.S. is going to continue to work with the Taliban to get Americans and allied Afghans out of the country. He vowed those behind today's attack will not go unpunished.
To those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this: we will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay.
Tough talk, Jackson, but it is a mess. The evacuation mission was already ending, thousands left behind. Is there any sense of what happens now?
Well, things are obviously much more complicated. There are still about 1,000 U.S. citizens in the country, perhaps up to 250,000 eligible Afghans waiting to leave as well. The Pentagon acknowledges, though, that there are ongoing threats from ISIS-K that could include attempts to shoot down the planes carrying people out of the country or perhaps drive car bombs into the airport. But the delicate in-person work that the U.S. Marines were doing today is actually going to continue amidst all that. The soldiers who were killed today were actually doing physical screening of people approaching the airport, pat-downs and bag searches, putting themselves at grave danger to carry out this mission. The Pentagon says it's now asking the Taliban to expand the security perimeter around the airport, and President Biden hinted that the U.S. is also looking for ways that would allow people to leave the country even after the U.S. military mission concludes next week.
Okay, Jackson in Washington, thanks. Now, the Canadian response. Justin Trudeau is on the campaign trail as Liberal leader, but he is still the Prime Minister. He has to handle Canada's response and answer questions about what happens now. Abigail Bimman is traveling with the Liberal campaign. Abigail.
Donna, Justin Trudeau was asked again and again today, what is his message to the people left behind, and where is the accountability for not getting them out faster? He didn't answer, but he did stress Canada will continue to help.
This particular moment is done, and it's heartbreaking to see, but there is much more to do, and Canada will continue to be there for Afghans and the Afghan people.
Trudeau said Canada will continue to put pressure on the Taliban to let people leave, although he wouldn't elaborate as to how.
We're continuing to do everything we can, both to bring tens of thousands of Afghans with their families to Canada, but also to keep putting pressure on the Taliban to ensure that people can leave Afghanistan and come to Canada.
Trudeau stressed the Canadian commitment to help resettle 20,000 people from Afghanistan, but he didn't tackle the issues around the red tape and clogged bureaucracy getting in the way of getting people out. He seemed today to blame the speed with which the Taliban took over for making things more difficult, though he's been criticized about that since people watching the region knew these tensions were boiling over for a long time. Trudeau spent the day in Quebec, key to any hopes of a Liberal majority, but questions about Afghanistan and Canada's moral obligation to the Afghan people continue to overshadow the campaign. Donna?
Abigail, thanks. The leaders of the New Democrats and Conservatives were asked about the situation in Afghanistan today, too. This is, in part, what they said.
The Trudeau government has failed to act, and they have abandoned people on the ground in Afghanistan. That's not Canada's way. That's not the Canada of Vimy Ridge and Juno Beach.
It's sad to say that Canada has failed, and Justin Trudeau knew about this problem, knew about the concerns, and didn't act in a timely way. And as a result, there's going to be lots of people now that are pretty desperate and not sure what's going to happen to them.
The Afghan army's commander is feeling betrayed. We'll tell you what he had to say a little later in the newscast. Plus, 2 months after a monstrous fire in BC, the mission to rebuild a village. We are on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. 95% of British Columbia, including Vancouver, is on unceded territory, meaning First Nations people never ceded or legally signed away their lands to the Crown or to Canada. Global National is back in a moment. British Columbia is a political battleground. More than a dozen ridings feature tight three-way races. And if Justin Trudeau is going to get the majority he is seeking, he needs to win over voters here. And there is a burning issue that can't be ignored. BC is still in the midst of one of the worst forest fire seasons on record. 1,500 fires so far this year, forcing thousands of people from their homes. 242 active fires are burning right now.
Hitzerekorde, Waldbrände, ein Flammeninferno.
The crisis is so severe it made headlines around the world.
En Colombie-Britannique, le record de température a été pulvérisé à Lytton.
Lytton liked to call itself Canada's hotspot, but this was off the charts. The inferno erased the town in a few hours. It had hit 49.6 degrees Celsius, breaking the Canadian heat record for 3 straight days. BC is not prepared for this, and in Lytton, dozens of families have no homes to go back to. Robin Gill reports.
Donna, that's all that's left of Lytton. 95% of the village was destroyed, and it's been 2 months since that fire. Residents are still waiting to go in to see if any personal items can be salvaged, but they know that it's going to take years to rebuild.
I still have markings of the fire on my face.
Nikki Weston James had no time to flee the Lytton fire. She felt the hot ashes fall on her face, her arms, and her legs.
There was so much ash flying through the air, and I could hear the wind, just...
A week later, she went back to the village looking for her home, but it was gone.
Just a pile of ash. And that's when it sunk in, Everything I had was in there.
Now, like so many of her former neighbors, she's homeless, a victim of a climate crisis the elders of this community long predicted.
We knew that it was coming. And so Mother Earth is heating up in the core. And she's sending up all of these messages, and human beings are not listening.
John Hogan, the deputy chief of the Lytton First Nation, lost his home in the fire too. He'd never experienced heat like this.
When Lytton hit 49.6, you wouldn't think that a place in the interior of BC would get that way before a place in the Mediterranean.
If the loss facing his family and community isn't a wake-up call, he doesn't know what it'll take.
It's here, and in my books, it's real.
The whole village is going.
The behemoth fire that wiped out the village is known as the Lytton Creek Fire. It was first discovered June 30th and didn't even register as a wildfire. Then the winds picked up and the flames just grew. On July 7th, it was 8,000 hectares. By July 22nd, it was almost double that. Today, it's 84,000 hectares.
Fire is ever increasing, and it's going to be an imminent danger for many more people.
How do you govern a municipality that doesn't really exist right now?
It's hard.
Jan Polderman is the mayor of Lytton. It was a part-time job, or so he thought. Every day he fields calls from residents.
It's hard on them. They're hurt. They're angry.
We caught up with him between meetings to create a new, greener community, insulated with fire fences, a sprinkler system, and new building bylaws.
The building bylaw is meant to create houses that are fire resistant. And what we're hoping is that should another firestorm begin, that it'll slow the spread so that people have more time to evacuate.
At 76, Nikki Weston James welcomes this change.
Let's start doing preventative.
It'll take at least a year before the village gets infrastructure in place, a year after that for homes to be constructed. Until then, lives are on hold. Nikki Weston James says she'll wait until the village is up and running before she returns.
I could never not want to go back to Lytton. I was born and raised there. This is where my people are.
You can see this haze still hanging over Lytton. Well, it's been like this in many parts of BC because of months of forest fires. Firefighting officials say it will take a fall snowstorm before this fire season can be put to rest. Donna?
All right, Robin, thanks. More frequent weather extremes next. How the federal election outcome could shape Canada's climate. A summer of record heat, drought and wildfires has magnified the climate crisis. Canada's federal party leaders all have plans they say will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Eric Sorensen takes a look at those plans and whether they're enough.
If only BC's heat and wildfires this summer were a one-time freak of nature. They're not, any more so than the unprecedented wildfires in the Mediterranean and in Siberia, or the historic floods in Europe and in China.
You just look anywhere around the world and you see climate catastrophe unfolding.
A major UN report says climate change is real, is indisputably caused by humans, and a hotter future is certain.
We know that the climate crisis is impacting us right now.
Which party will deliver on the ever more urgent targets to slash carbon emissions that come from Canadian industry and agriculture, and from our homes and cars? Here are the party's different plans, all with a 2030 target date. The Liberals say they will reduce emissions 40 to 45% below 2005 levels. The Conservatives, less specific, point to the Harper government's targets, which were 30% lower. The NDP is promising emissions at least 50% lower, and the Green Party 60% below those 2005 targets. But are plans based on a 2015 agreement still good in 2021? Following up the Paris Agreement, world leaders will be pressed for more ambitious targets at the next climate summit in Scotland this fall. A new survey by Ipsos for Global News found 77% of Canadians say this country needs to do more on climate change. The Liberal leader says he will.
It's going to take even more ambition, yes, but even more ability to deliver.
But critics say the Liberals have not delivered on targets so far, while the Conservatives aren't saying whether they'll up their targets to keep pace with the other parties.
We worked hard to have a plan that will meet our Paris reduction targets, but get people back to work.
Meantime, construction has begun on the new TMX pipeline extension from Alberta to BC, even as the International Energy Agency calls for no new oil and gas development.
We do not support one single new pipeline in Canada.
Only the Green Party has called for a full halt to TMX. The Liberals and Conservatives backed the pipeline, and the NDP stopped short of pulling the plug.
I'm opposed to the expansion, and I think that there's better things that we can do with that money right now.
We continue to have these two separate conversations, one about the oil and gas industry, one about climate, and the politicians are resisting connecting the two.
A country that is among the most dependent on fossil fuels has hard decisions to make as Canadians increasingly confront the harsh realities of climate change. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Next, I speak with British Columbians about what will influence their vote. There are safe ridings, but this federal election is shaping up to be so tight nothing can be taken for granted. I went to Steveston Village in Richmond, BC yesterday, once the epicenter of Western Canada's fishing industry. The cannery is a museum now, but families still make their living fishing. The riding went Conservative last time and Liberal before that. I'm trying to talk to average people, and not the experts and not the politicians, but just people like you. So, and asking if you've decided how you're going to vote.
Oh, big question.
Sisters Michelle and Teresa Deboo are lifelong Liberals.
I trust Trudeau. He's done what he can for this country, and he's done his very best in probably the worst of times.
I was definitely happy with Trudeau and the way he handled the pandemic at the start. Yeah, I'm a little bit worried about the whole Afghanistan thing right now. I worry that we're leaving, so many behind.
It's not hard to find people here who voted for Justin Trudeau in the past and say they never will again.
He has disappointed me a few times.
In what sense?
In the corruption charges, in his lies, and never fulfilling any of it for the Truth and Reconciliation report.
Others think Trudeau only called the election to try to get a majority.
Oh, I have to get another 4-year term. That's so selfish.
Last election, I voted Liberal, and under the Liberal watch,
These salmon are disappearing. They've done a very poor job of managing the resources on the West Coast.
Paul and Lynette Kershaw are selling freshly caught Chinook salmon, but say it's getting harder to make a living this way, and they don't think Trudeau gets it. Minutes later, look who shows up.
Hey there, good to see you.
We didn't know the Liberal leader was coming, nor did many here. There were lots of smiles and selfies, but some unhappiness too. Lynette Kershaw, salmon in hand, tried to seize the moment.
This might be the last Chinook salmon that I'm allowed to catch.
Others tried to avoid Trudeau, like Donna England, who voted for him last time.
I'm not voting for that guy.
Not voting for him.
No. I'm First Nations, and do you know how many people across Canada just want running water in their village?
It's something we heard from political supporters of all the parties. Stop making promises you can't keep. George O'Donnell and his son, both veterans, got a selfie with Trudeau.
Do you think he deserves to be re-elected?
Yeah, there's nobody else.
They're both sickened by the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan.
It's, another example where, they made promises and didn't deliver. So it's very sad, especially with the lost lives and the injuries.
And that is Global National for this Thursday, a devastating day in Afghanistan. This is how the American-led war ends, in disaster and more death. First signing a surrender agreement with the Taliban, then abandoning the Afghan army, watching the rights of girls and women be extinguished, then failing to evacuate all of those who almost certainly will be hunted down by the Taliban. In an essay in the New York Times, the commander of the Afghan army writes, "We were betrayed by politics and presidents. This is not an Afghan war only. This was an international war with many militaries. This was a military defeat, but it emanated from political failure." Tonight's Your Canada is this from political cartoonist Michael de Adder. Thanks for watching.